Popcorn Therapy, holistic health and wellness through the lens of pop culture. I'm Julie Peters. I'm a counseling therapist, a tarot reader, a writer, and a witch. I love to think deeply about pop culture and find out what our stories can tell us about who we are as individuals and as a culture, spiritually, psychologically, physically, and in all kinds of other ways. If you like that too, you are in the right place. Welcome to Popcorn Therapy. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Popcorn Therapy. This is part one of 2 episodes on the White Lotus, season 3. There was so much to talk about, so many different character arcs that we wanted to go through, and so we're going to be having 2 separate episodes on this. So please enjoy this episode with me and Emilee Nimetz, who is my sort of unofficial co-host for a lot of these episodes. They are an actor, they also love pop culture, and we are old friends who have been texting each other the whole time we've been watching The White Lotus. So you're going to listen to our conversation all about it, goes in sort of all different kinds of directions. And then we're going to have a second episode so you can listen to that and just sort of complete the conversation when you're ready. So thanks for listening, and here we go. So one thing that I'll say about White Lotus that I found interesting, I'm usually not up to date with shows that people are watching. I usually watch them way later. And this one, my husband and I were, eagerly anticipating Sunday night so that we could watch it together. And it was really nice, I found, to have that paratext that we talked about in previous episodes where the TikTok of it all, the Instagram of it all, like a lot of people talking about White Lotus on social media. It was really interesting to watch the theories coming out of people saying, okay, I think this is going to happen, whatever it is, but nobody actually knew. So we were all kind of watching the story together. And I thought that was really nice because it's been so long since, we used to watch TV when it aired on television, and in the binge era, we don't really do that in the same way. So I thought it was actually kind of cool that you'd watch it on Sunday night and then throughout the week, you'd see people's reactions. And I think it affected the way that I watched the show. It affected how I felt about the finale, I think, for sure. That definitely had a different impact for me than I think if I just watched the show, from nowhere, just kind of binging from the beginning. What do you think, Emilee?
Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate that. It's definitely our attention spans aren't as used to it. So I feel like we go to these networks of people on social media to talk about it as much as possible, which really reminds me of the olden days of network television when an episode of Grey's Anatomy would be released and there'd be a huge cliffhanger. And then all week, that's all you're talking about. And it's, and if you miss it's a bit different, but back then, if you miss the episode, when do you watch it? I don't know. Yeah, so I do like that because I like kind of going to the internet and seeing what people have to say. And I feel like I kind of absorb a lot of, the interpretations. I do love the analysis a little more than the predictions. I find the predictions are a bit maybe, but we don't really know. And it's already written, it's already done. So, but I do enjoy the analysis of it and okay, did you catch this symbolism, or let's review this, relationship, or, just the Parker Posey of it all, just in general, was so fun. So, yeah.
Parker Posey was such a delight throughout this whole season.
Yes, love.
Yeah. So, initially I didn't think that we would necessarily do a podcast on White Lotus because honestly, I find the storytelling so complex. And I found that to be true throughout the seasons. I've been thinking actually about what is this show about? What is this show? Because there have been 3 seasons so far, and each season stands alone to a degree in the sense that you meet this brand new cast of characters and you get to know them. And I think the characters are really, sometimes they're ridiculous, sometimes they're sort of, they're big characters, but they're also relatable, I think, in a lot of ways. The characters are really, it's very interesting to watch them, face ethical dilemmas or, try to figure out how they're going to handle a certain situation or whatever it might be. And there is increasingly a through line. Like we had some characters from season 1 recurring in this one. We've heard that season 4, that storyline is going to continue in some way. I feel like each season has felt like a character study. And it's not so much, I feel, this show about like what's going to happen. Like there was a lot of that. And,
Mm-hmm.
each season sort of starts with there was a murder or like a body was found and you're trying to figure out throughout the season, like whose body, what happened. But I feel like ultimately the reason you watch that, it's not like a detective show, it's really
Mm-hmm.
more so about getting to know these characters. And so, it felt initially sort of too complex maybe to even talk about in a podcast form, because I was like, what kind of thesis could I come up with this? Like, I'm still trying to figure out what Mike White is trying to do. I don't know. So tell me what you think about that. Like, what do you think this show is? What is this show about?
That's a great question. I think that this show is about capitalism. And I think it's through the lens, like, there's different implications of capitalism each season. So I think season 1 really has to do with just money in general, but it also really has to do with colonialism and ownership, like the ownership of just the land of the indigenous Hawaiian people, but also the ownership of like Sydney Sweeney and like her ownership over her best friend, and then like the ownership of you know Armand over like the hotel, and the ownership of over this entitled young man who is just being a brat, and then that character's ownership over his like kind of everything he feels entitled to. So I feel like that's kind of what that one was about. And then I think season 2 was really about sex and love, as the kind of lens in which to kind of consider and view capitalism. And then I think, which I think is pretty obvious, especially with Italy being the location, and a lot of the dynamics, like there was affairs and there was all of this relationship drama. Um, and then season 3, I think I'm still processing it, but I would say that, and from what I've heard Mike White say about it, and just like a lot of people online are saying, like, I think it really has to do with identity, and also the Buddhist principles of like attachment to identity, to the self. I think that's really explored in this location. And I think that like an Asian culture really makes sense in the context of capitalism, because like white folks, specifically like American, Canadian, like Western white folks, often travel to Asian countries to, explore the identity, like the sort of like racist trope of like Asian mysticism and how that impacts everything.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that season 3 was set in Thailand, and that it had this interesting mix of sex tourism as sort of a part of the plot in some points, but also that this is a place where Buddhism is really prominent. And there was
Mm-hmm.
a lot about Buddhism in the show. Gay Talk and Mook were Thai characters who spoke only in Thai, pretty much, to
Mm-hmm.
each other at least, and had discussions about, what would the Buddha do about this, and what does the principle of nonviolence really mean? And I think that was, as someone who studied Buddhism, to a degree through my yoga practices and so on, and meditation practices, it was interesting to kind of watch what they were doing with that. And I was sort of curious too about, because Mike White is a white guy, as far as I know.
Yeah.
And when he had the Buddhist monk sort of speaking and giving these lectures and stuff like that, I was kind of wondering, like, okay, is he close to Buddhism? Like, does he kind of know what this stuff is about? How does he feel like he's teaching people with this? Or is he just sort of watching from the lens of these white characters misunderstanding it, or
Mm-hmm.
sort of trying to step their toes into it in a way of like, oh, this is something that will give you peace. And it's all these sort of unhappy rich people who just have so much privilege and don't know what to do with it, and don't have meaningful lives based on that. And Carrie Coon's monologue at the end was kind of about meaning, like where do you get meaning, like where do you get your
Mm-hmm.
source of belief, and so on. And so I feel like that was a big theme in the show as well. Like maybe not so much spirituality, but meaning. Like what
Yeah.
is meaning? Where does it come from? Is it your relationships? Is it your success? Is it who people think you are? Is it how you're
Mm-hmm.
perceived? Is it your inner experience? All of those things. And I appreciate, very much about the show that a lot of those questions were not answered in a neat and tied up kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some people on the internet were irritated about the finale, all the questions that were left with the
Hmm.
finale. And, maybe some of those questions will get further, not only about Buddhism, but about the characters and how did they deal with this and what was the aftermath. Like, people have a lot of questions about, like, I keep thinking of, oh, sorry, obviously spoilers. We're going to be talking about spoilers this whole time. But, I keep thinking about Lachlan finding out that his dad is involved in this criminal thing and might have to go to jail and stuff. And then thinking back and being like, what was in that blender? you know? And just being like, hold on, did my dad try to kill us all? Like,
Yeah.
wait a second. And then what does that mean to him? And how does he deal with that? And like, what a traumatic experience for Lachlan that whole week
Hmm.
in so many ways. So, you kind of want to know, like, okay, so what happens next to this family?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if we'll see the Ratliffs again. I could see them just fading into the storyline's background for sure and
Yeah.
leaving those questions unanswered. But I think people were really wondering, like, but what happens next, after all of this? So, yeah.
Yeah, it was okay. Also, just shout out to Tim Ratcliffe, the shirt that he wore, the Tommy Bahama shirt that he wore when he tried to kill his family. I am wearing that shirt right now because, yes, I do have that Tommy Bahamas and I thrifted it. And I'm the same as Tim Ratcliffe. So watch out.
Iconic, iconic.
I had to
Love
sport it
that.
for today for the
Of
pod.
course, yes, of
Um,
course.
yeah, I feel like there is a kind of dissatisfaction that I think a lot of people felt with the ending. That's the impression that I'm getting. Um, I do feel like we were a little bit robbed of like watching Parker Posey react to that news. Like I think that that would have been an iconic television moment. And I do feel a little bit unresolved around the family situation because I do feel like there is a bit of like, well, even though he dreamed of killing everyone in his family the whole week and almost killed himself and like all of this, he really overcame it. And I feel like that is sort of different than how we often see, oftentimes in the Mike White universe of the White Lotus, rich folks face zero consequences for any of their bad behavior and for doing any of these harmful, intrusive things, like whether intentional or not. And so I thought that it was weird that the Tim Ratliff character got a bit of like a spiritual like thing that he overcame. Like he seemed really at peace with whatever fate had in store for him whenever he goes to the other, like turns on his phone and gets this, information, like whether he's going to jail or what. Um, but so that was kind of weird to me that we got to see him feel resolved and at peace with that, especially, well, I guess it does kind of show that, like, it's like, does he care about his family? Like, the fact that he's like, I love you all and we can handle anything. It's like, I don't know, like you just listen to them all say like we cannot handle a life that's different than our current like very high status of wealth. Um so anyway, all of that's to say that I did feel like I would have loved to see a little Parker Posey see a little a meltdown about that.
Totally. So just to speak to the Buddhist aspect of it a little bit more in relation to the Ratliffs, yeah, I think that was a very interesting story arc for Timothy Ratliff. Um, he is definitely someone whose identity has been tied in with success and money and so on. Um, we don't totally know what the thing is that he did, but he's obviously panicking about it. And his colleague who was involved as well was like, I'm going to kill myself.
Mhm.
And so, he's thinking about that the whole time. But there were such interesting moments of him wondering where the gun went when he went to find it. So, he's wondering where the gun went. And in the moment where he's confused about where the gun went, you're thinking, dude, you stole that gun from the security, the guard box or whatever it is, like at the front. Do you not think somebody would be looking for that? Like, did it never occur to
Yeah.
you that maybe someone would be affected by the fact that you stole a gun that wasn't yours? And, so he finds this other alternative or whatever it is. But I feel like there were just such moments of cluelessness, really, from that family in a lot of ways.
Mm.
And so, Piper, yeah, Piper, was an interesting character to watch. I saw a reel about there being an insufferable character in every season of White Lotus. There's somebody who's appears to be sort of morally above everyone else, but ultimately isn't, and they
Yeah.
come from a place of judgment and all that. And I really thought it was so interesting when, first of all, she told everyone she needed to go to Thailand for this thesis, made them all come with her, and then, was like, oh, you chose this place, Dad. Like, this isn't where I would
Yeah.
have chosen to go. And like, it's the White Lotus, and it's an extremely expensive resort, right? And then when she went into the monastery and to have a conversation with the monk who was going to take her for the year program or whatever, she has the privilege of sitting down one-on-one with the spiritual teacher. She's like, can you just talk to my parents? Because they don't want me to come. And like, I can come because I'm an adult. And you're like, are you?
Yeah.
And, but if they don't like it, then it's going to be hard for me. And he's just like, okay, I'll talk to your parents, like whatever.
Mhm.
But, I'm just thinking, if I had the opportunity to sit down with, one of these spiritual teachers, like that I've read books of or whatever it is, like, I wouldn't ask them to talk to my parents for me to see if I could stay. Like, no, that's just so absurd, and I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of that was her privilege showing
Yeah.
through, and also her reliance on her parents, right? Her inability to kind of make decisions by herself. And so in that moment, I was like, okay, Piper, like you are an extremely entitled white girl. And and actually, while we were in the middle of watching White Lotus, my husband and I, we've also been watching Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the show for the podcast, which I hope to do an episode on soon. But we went back to watch the movie because it's one of my husband's favorites. And there are all these moments where Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie like finish a tequila and just throw the glass on the floor. And I'm watching it, we're just like, these white people are done with their drink. It's like, they just like could throw it on the floor at this, wherever they are, like in Mexico or wherever. It's just like, this white person's done. Like, someone clean that up. And that's kind of how I felt about Piper, that whole family, right? They're just like,
Yeah.
whatever, I will create whatever chaos I want. And it will never occur to me that it might have an effect on somebody. And of course, it didn't surprise me that much when Piper kind of had that turnaround where she was like, I guess I don't want to eat bland vegetarian food. Like I'm a privileged person and I want to do that. Again, having studied Buddhism, a little bit, and from not from a that I looked at Buddhism sort of through, I've studied Tantra a lot more, like Hindu Tantra, and like some of the, there's some overlap there, with Buddhist Tantra too. So anyway, it's like I have my different branches that I've studied. I'm not an expert on it. But that idea of non-attachment and being in the present moment is very powerful. And of course, it's a wellness resort, right? In this particular case, where they're encouraged to detox from their phones and really try to be present with like these beautiful things, while at the same time it is a rich person's resort where they can get massages and take advantage of the staff. And, they have that hot Valentin who is, his job is in part to just be hot
Yeah.
and like probably sleeps with people all the time who are guests. And there's a lot of boundary crossing in that way and so on. And you could kind of see the way, Belinda ended up sort of taking advantage of porn chai in the same way that Tanya took advantage of her in season 1, where it's this kind of racialized. I was seeing something about how, I think you sent it to me actually, about how there's a racialized aspect to those two relationships. So Tanya was this white woman taking advantage of Belinda, who is a black masseuse, promised her some money to start her business and then kind of bailed when the situation changed for her. Belinda and Pornchai were really on the same level, more so because they were both staff and so on. And then when she comes into some money, she leaves him behind. And there's that scene at the end where she's kind of waving goodbye on the boat and he's just standing, waving as one of the staff, goodbye to this relationship and those hopes and dreams and all of those other things. So anyway, there's just some very interesting stuff about the meditation teacher and like how often it sort of came up to be like, think of yourself as a drop in the ocean, you're one of many, death is a return to home, non-attachment, because there can be joy in these individual moments and so on. And then that's contrasted with all these white people, including Frank, who is the epitome of indulgence, in his active addiction. And we can talk more about that because that's a whole can of worms to open. But yeah, I mean, I'm not quite resolved about what I think Mike White was doing in this case, because I feel like he was representing Buddhism to a degree in a relatively authentic way, I think. And again, I liked in Gay Talk's story how he was grappling with the idea of nonviolence because I don't think it was so simple for him, like what it would mean to do harm and not do harm and so on. So I liked those aspects of it, but some of the characters changed and had experiences from that. Some of them didn't, right? Some of
Hmm.
them didn't pick up on any of those learnings. So
Hmm.
yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts about how the spirituality aspect of it was used, especially maybe from a colonial lens, because as you were saying, that does seem to be part of what the show has always been about, is people in these locations sort of taking advantage of the local culture and stuff. It's sort of,
Hmm.
there's a tourist capitalist is a huge aspect of the show, right?
Totally. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like, with the Tim story, where he talks to the Buddha, and like when you're talking about the Piper, and Piper's like, "Can you talk to my parents?" But Tim asks a real question. Of course, it's
Mm-hmm.
coming from a place of like, "So should I kill myself?" Like, and it's interesting to see this like character, say some sort of like Buddhist scripture kind of like information in a really calm and gentle and loving way, and his immediate thought is like, so death will release everybody from this, like just a complete misinterpretation of that. And so I think that's really interesting, like to show that, because I think that is what happens a lot of the time, is that white cultures, Western cultures, will like pick and choose aspects of these practices as a way to kind of justify their continued individualism, or like their continued colonization, or like white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy, like the way that it's like you can use those things to just like justify your own agenda is really harmful. And something as well, I don't know if you told me this or if I read this in a book or something, but isn't there something about how Buddha was a prince, like was a really
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
wealthy prince? And so I was thinking about that a lot, because it's like, and I've had conversations with people about this before, where it's like there is something when you're coming from a place of wealth, it's a lot easier to have like this like non-attachment, because, and I'm not a practicing Buddhist. I'm not trying to like drag the religion or anything. But like just as an observation, it's like it is a lot easier to kind of like say those things from a position of like, you're not really risking anything, like to ask a poor person to be like, don't have attachments to your items, is like, well, if I don't have attachments to them, I might lose them and be homeless. Like it's different than like say a wealthy person who it's like, I'm going to just, like I think of a lot, actually a lot, I think of this story a lot from season 1, when the younger brother Quinn in the family, and at the end of the series, he escapes. He decides to not go on the plane, and he's going to go and do this rowing venture with these like Native Hawaiians.
Right, right.
And I think a lot about that, because I think a lot of the time, like when the analysis that I'm seeing online, are a lot of people being like, he's the golden character. He escaped the brutality of his family, and I'm like, no, he is a white boy with privilege who is risking zero to do that. Like he can go participate in that culture, and the second he doesn't want to do it anymore, his family's going to run to his rescue. And he's never going to be stranded. He's never going to suffer. He's not going to be connected to the land and its teachings in the same way that those men are, and he has nothing to lose with doing that. Like he's literally like completely untouchable. He surely has a trust fund. Like he doesn't have to think about the world and its implications. Like these indigenous folks are actively battling like in courts over the ownership of this land, and this young boy is like, I want to row around the world. And so I always think that it's actually a pretty insidious like depiction of colonialism and the way that it presents itself in our day-to-day lives. And so I think that that's, yeah, like a common theme that I see with that, and especially with like, yeah, the Buddhism of it all, where it's like, yeah, like if you're super wealthy, it's like, oh, we're so blessed, and like it's so easy to possess those feelings of gratitude when like you've stumbled into wealth and you don't really know any other kind of like, you don't know the suffering that, let's say, the hotel staff know, or the sex workers that Frank frequents. Like you don't know the kind of suffering that they endure to maintain their lives. Like Guy Talk is literally questioning whether or not to kill somebody, and that's his only way, according to his love interest Mook, how he can advance and like be loved by this person is to cause violence, and that's the only way to make it in the world. You know, like we're talking about like real life and death circumstances. So it is interesting to see like a story of like the Ratliffs where it's like they actually are potentially facing some like real world consequences. Although I do kind of get the sense that they probably have offshore accounts, and there's no way Victoria Ratliff didn't sign a prenup and comes from money. Like I just don't imagine any world where she suffers. So like that's in my eyes probably what happened. But yeah, I think it's interesting, like the question of like Buddhism and privilege and how that kind of all plays into it, because yeah, it's like Piper's like, I don't want to. The bed has stains, and you know the food wasn't very good, and a whole year doing that, like I could never. It's like that's someone who's just like is really not spiritual, you know, at the core of it, you know, and she's not curious about those things. She's more interested in the identity attached to spirituality, in the way that she's like scolding her family for embarrassing her, in the way that she's like, you know, trying to make eyes with Loki to not eat. Like she was annoyed with how he was eating. Like it's all this stuff where it's like, oh, you're more interested in the identity of seeming like somebody who's interested in this, not like you are actively interested in a practice of this. You're not a Buddhist.
You want to stay in Taiwan? The look on Victoria Ratliff's face too when Piper said all that, that she was like, maybe I do like privilege or whatever that was. She was just like such a proud mama of being like, I was right, and I love that for me.
Icon.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts about what you just said. So yeah, that's true that in the Buddhist story, he was a prince and had all of the privilege that he could have had in the world. And his parents, there was a prophecy that he would either be a great king or a great teacher. And his parents, who were royalty, wanted him to be a king. So they gave him everything that they wanted. And that backfired because he had so much that he kind of ran out the clock on that being interesting. And now that you mention that, that's what Frank did, right? Like he had a lot of money and he went to Thailand where you don't need a lot, and he just used it for whatever sex, drugs, and rock and roll he wanted to. And it was empty for him at the end of that road, right? Like he just found like, this isn't who I am and what I want. And it was quite, I have to say, I felt quite glad when, you know, towards the end you see him in the temple praying or whatever it is, and he's back in his recovery. That was tough to watch him kind of go back into that place, but satisfying to see, like, you know what, he came back out of it again, and he's back on that track. And that's often what recovery looks like, is there's ebbs and flows, right? Anyway, addiction is a theme we can come into, but yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you know, within Tantra, again, I've studied more Hindu Tantra than Buddhist Tantra, but part of the reason I like studying Tantra, I found it really interesting, is because, you know, the Christian worldview that I grew up in is very much like, you don't indulge in these things, sex is bad, you know, drinking is bad, all of these things. Like to be in the religious life of God, you have to follow these certain rules and God will let you into heaven or whatever it is. And with Tantra, it's more like God or goddess, in what I was studying, is in everything, you know, exists in everything. Like it's just primordial power, and it's amoral. Like it's not judging you, actually. Your actions have consequences from this perspective, but there's nobody judging whether you made the correct or incorrect action. So from a tantric perspective, you actually have to make your own ethical blueprint, because nobody's going to tell you what the right or wrong thing is to do. You have to make those decisions for yourself. And, you know, a lot of the time with, I'm going to come back to cults in a second, but like a lot of Christian perspectives, and specifically cultic perspectives, will say, we have all the answers. We can tell you how to solve the meaning of life. We can tell you what you have to do in order to feel meaning or feel happy or be less stressed or whatever it is. And a lot of people don't want to have to be in a place of like, oh, I have to think about this for myself. Like I have to actually decide this.
Yeah.
And I think you see some of the characters in this season in particular facing those questions. Like nobody's going to answer that for them. Gay talk, maybe especially. But what I thought, so anyway, within Tantra, you'll seek out certain kinds of experiences, you know, and obviously there's parameters around this, and you're not going sex on a sex tour trip to like, you know, be spiritual or something. I guess you could, but you know, it's more so like, okay, everything has a place. Like, In some specific areas of Tantra, you might be using sex as a ritual tool, or you might be using psychedelic substances as a tool, or you might be doing something that's really sort of off-putting to you. It would be like, in that traditional world, you would be vegetarian, and so eating meat would be seen as eating cockroaches. It would be like so disgusting, but you would eat the meat in order to have this experience in your body of like disgust, and that disgust is something that could take you closer to an experience of the god that lives in disgust, because in Tantra there's like god and goddess for like every experience that you could have. So, I think from that perspective, like Frank's experience and some of the others too, and maybe even, Tim and Lachlan, like even experiencing death, going right up next to the door of death, that was something that, that taught them something important about, who they were, or spirit, or, however you want to call it. So with that in mind, from the cult perspective, it was interesting to me that Tim and Victoria were so worried that, Victoria was so worried that this Buddhist monastery was going to be a sex cult. So, like, that's what they kept being like, Piper, don't go, like, it's going to be a sex cult. And that scene when Tim has made them all the poison pina coladas and they're all standing around together drinking them. And he's like, drink them, they're good. That's a cult, right? Like that has happened in many, like specifically white people cults, like Christian adjacent cults, that have been about, I mean, I don't know the whole story of those, but, it's the drinking the Kool-Aid is a cliche because of these cults where people were drinking, they thought that that's what they were supposed to do. And it turned out to be these mass murders, sort of justified for spiritual reasons. And so interesting to kind of see them being so fearful that this monastery was a cult, and then it's the family cult, right? I have a supervisor who does a lot of family therapy, and also recovery from cults is something that he specializes in as well, and has talked before about how the family is a cult. Like when you're doing family system work, you're also like the cult and the family system work can often intersect with each other, because like cults, families often have, outspoken and unspoken rules and structures, and people have to play certain roles, and you can't transgress certain boundaries, and things like that. And so, I think we could look at the Ratliffs as a cult for sure in a lot of different ways that's very organized around money and privilege. And again, I kind of want to know the aftermath of that. Like, if that's no longer there, what happens to that family system, right? What happens to the family system where now there's going to be this big secret, right? This big traumatic secret between Lachlan and Saxon, in terms of, sexual trauma. Like that's not something they're just going to forget, that happened. And so within that family cult, how do they deal with that? Does anyone deal with it? If it's not dealt with, how is it passed down? Like these are the sort of issues that come up, right? So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And then, you just bringing up Quinn from the first season, looking at Piper versus Quinn, like these sort of young people who are like, I want to escape my privileged life, but that being so hollow in the sense of like, for what? Like, so that you can have that as your identity, or so that you can sort of steal from someone else's cultural experience, but not actually do your own work, which I think white people have lots of work to do about their spirituality and their religion and the land that they're on and where they came from and what kind of traumas that's about and so on. And a lot of white people would just much rather go to Thailand and stay at a wellness resort and like learn about some other religion than do their own work, right? Which is what a lot of the White Lotus people are doing. Okay. All right. So, well, why don't we talk about gay talk for a minute? Because I think guy talk.
Yeah.
Like talk between guys.
Guy talk.
Guy talk or gay talk.
Or both.
Or both, yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about guy talk and mook. Okay, guy talk. Is one of my one of the more interesting character arcs, partly because he does grapple with those Buddhist ideas. And so I think from the perspective of his story, it was interesting to watch him initially want to be a bodyguard, and the bodyguards were so kind of mean, I guess. There was sort of this sense of like, okay, you can get a promotion if you're a little more bloodthirsty. Like we want you to be able to handle this gun and be able to kill somebody if you need to, and so on. And so he's kind of trying to figure out, like, is that who I want to be? Is that something that works for me? And we see him praying and so on. And, he tells Mook at a certain point, like, I really believe in Buddhist nonviolence, and maybe I shouldn't be a guard. And we don't know, in his context, like, how easy would it be for him to get a different kind of job? Like, is this something
Yeah.
that is this one of his only options to do that? So towards the end, you see him figuring out who the robbers were. They're Valentin's Russian friends. And so he says, okay, I figured it out. I'm going to tell his boss or whatever, and I'm going to do something about it. But then, Valentin kind of says to him, if you tell on me, you're killing me. Like, I will be deported. I'll have to go back to Russia and I'll be killed. So if you do this, you're killing me. And I feel like that's kind of the classic conundrum that comes up with a concept like nonviolence, wherever you're getting it from, which is, what does that mean? Violence to
Mhm.
whom,
Yeah.
And I think, again, from that colonial perspective that we've been talking about a little bit, a lot of these privileged people don't see it as doing a harm to, go and take advantage of the sex tourism or whatever it is. And so, he's kind of in this conundrum where he's like, okay, if I tell on the robbers, that will be good for me at work, but it will harm them, right? So, like, who am I harming more? If I let it go on, they're going to continue robbing the hotel, which is harmful for the hotel. But, like, you're kind of weighing these different ethical things. And so, towards the end, in that moment where Rick is walking away, having just shot Shritala's husband, and she's screaming at him to shoot him. She's his, big boss and whatever. He wants to work for her. And he has to make this snap decision of, like, do I let him walk away or do I shoot this person? Like, what is the more ethical choice for me to make, right? And I
Mhm.
think part of the reason he makes the choice that a lot of us see into is that he'll get the girl, right? So one thing that I was quite disappointed about was that, Lalisa, who is one of the biggest stars in the world, is
Mhm.
on this show. And I kept waiting for her to be in on the robberies or in on some conspiracy with the bodyguards or needing Guy Talk to stay in his position for some reason because it was helping her get away with something. Like, I was expecting more from
Yeah.
her, but she was just a girl. She was just a girl that he liked. And she was like, I'm not into you if you're not, like, it felt like this very not man enough kind of thing where she was like, I don't like that nonviolence thing. And at a
Yeah.
certain point she said something like, but you have to live in this world. Like, you have to, which is, again, that's something that maybe we don't know so much about because we're not people like who are Thai living in Thai culture, what that means to her and so on. Some of it is, yeah, you do need to work for money and, like, that's part of survival. And as you were saying before, you can have non-attachment and non-violence if you already have everything set out for you and you don't have to fight for anything in your life.
Mhm.
But, when your survival is on the line, often you do have to make those dubious decisions. Whether even just from the perspective of, like, from my own happiness, do I keep doing this soulless job or, do I break out and take risks and, do something else? Like, at what cost am I going to do
Mhm.
to myself and the people around me and so on? So I think, those are interesting questions. And I'm not sure that I think that Guy Talk was only, making it for privilege and so on. Like, I don't see him as much going over to the dark side, even though I feel like there was that scene where he's in the car with Sri Tala and he's the new bodyguard because the other ones got killed in the shootout. He and Mook is just, like, walking behind the car. So you kind of see the sense of him kind of gaining this privilege and power from the choice that he made. But was it really the unethical choice, right? I mean, I think it was a difficult choice for him to make in that moment. I don't think it was so black and white,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I really liked that parable when, or I'm not sure like the exact word for it, but when they spoke about how it's like when you do, when there is a violent act, there is violence to the person who is being subjected to the violence, like the victim
Oh,
of the
yeah, they
violence.
say that at some point too, don't they?
Yeah, and then there's violence to like the
The
perpetrator.
perpetrator, yeah.
And so I sort of viewed that last moment as like he is going to suffer spiritually from that choice. Like that does go against his like very strong um Buddhist morals, or at least how he's been raised. It really contradicts that. But um he, I think, ultimately is seems really happy at the end. Like he's smiling, he's got this job, he's got the girl, you know, he's kind of got all this stuff, but like I think it probably does come at a cost of like his spiritual connection. And you know, I think because of his demeanor, you don't really see it kind of become, he doesn't, you don't really see him sort of becoming these like face tattooed bodyguards who are like really scary and intimidating. But like there is a sense of like he has lost a little bit of that like tender, sweet, sweet guy that we kind of met throughout the course of the 8 episodes. He definitely, you know, he's kind of stepping into this new version of himself.
Are you really hearing that squeaking?
I
Sorry.
am, but it's so cute.
Yeah, the internal cost. I mean, I feel like that's part of what is happening for Saxon and Timothy and some of the others. I don't. It's hard to know how much Greg slash Gary is suffering internally, but you know, you kind of have this external world of like, well, I mean, maybe even Greg slash Gary, because you know they have all this external privilege. He's got this beautiful house. I think Gary slash Greg looked really haunted the whole time. You know, that actor, I think, just did a really great job in terms of that. Like, he never looked happy at one point in the whole show, even with
Yeah.
like this beautiful girlfriend and this beautiful house and throwing these parties and whatever it is. It's like um, you know, he killed Tanya for all this money, and is he happy? You know, did he get what he wanted? And I think Frank is an interesting example of that too, because, you know, that's somebody who's on that extreme end of like, okay, you can have everything you want, and then what, right? And how far does that go?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think internal cost is an interesting one. And Timothy almost lost his sort of innocent son, right? Like from the actions that he was taking. Like, as you said, a lot of the time the rich people don't face any consequences at all. And maybe some of what we were looking at in this season was internal costs, like not just whether you're being held accountable by someone else, but what happens to you internally when you go through
Hmm.
these things. Because at the end, you're kind of watching Greg slash Gary and his girlfriend is like trying to find someone for them to have a threesome with that he can walk in on, you know, and he's just
His
like
cup
sitting there watching
fantasy.
like this creepy wink, and you're like, ew, like that's just so uncomfortable. Like that can't be. I don't know. Like that was just such a weird and sad story about him. Like I don't know why she needed to tell all the details to everyone at the party. She could have just said like he has a fetish for walking in on like she could have just said that
Yeah,
instead
that's
of
a
being
lot of
like,
his business.
yeah, it's a lot of his business and childhood trauma that like we didn't need to know that. Um and yeah, and I think in terms of internal costs too. I mean, Rick, there's lots to say about Rick and Chelsea, but you know, it's interesting that he had this whole story about his life, which is that his life was kind of robbed from him
Hmm.
because his father was killed. And what an interesting thing to assume that your father was a good person, you know, and that your life would have been better if he had been there.
Yeah.
And to kind of find out in this very telenovela way that, like, you know, Rick, he is your father, you know, whatever it is. After all, which, like, of course, I think a lot of us saw that coming. But you know, he suffered from that narrative, right? Rather than saying like, okay, well, that's a shitty circumstance to come from, but how can I process that, or how can I deal with that differently, or how can I, you know, make my life meaningful on my own terms, rather than just like blaming someone my whole life for everything that went wrong. You know, not that it's unfair to blame someone for killing your dad, like obviously, but ultimately he never takes responsibility for his life because he thinks that the responsibility is all on this person. And it's not 100% clear. Like Rick must have some money to be there, and initially I think we assume he and Chelsea are together because he's this rich older guy and she's this hot young woman. And as we watch them, we see the way that she's really like in love with him. And I can say more about this from a trauma perspective and addiction perspective and so on. I don't think that was a love relationship. I think that was something else. But it wasn't necessarily just about money for Chelsea, I don't think.
No.
So yeah, I think like he pays like whatever he does for work or money or whatever it is, he pays a huge internal cost for even just carrying that narrative around his whole life and never being able to have that moment of like, oh, what could I do differently to make my life more mine? Right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, there was, like, Walton Goggins himself made this post on Instagram at the end of that episode where he's smiling on the couch and all the debauchery is happening, and he's
Hmm.
like, Rick worked so hard for this smile. And I just thought it was a really weird interpretation because I personally didn't view that moment. I didn't actually think that Rick had achieved any sort of satisfaction. In fact, I thought it was just strange. Like, I thought it was actually kind of a strange and weird reaction. Like, he had achieved this thing, but it was almost like a sense of dominance, which I think is probably how somebody like Rick achieves any sort of satisfaction in his life, is through dominance, And I think back to bell hooks. I think we talked about this on Nosferatu, like where you can't, like, love doesn't exist with violence, like that,
Yeah.
like physical violence can't coexist. And so the fact that Rick, you know, tips this chair over with this elderly man who's like frail and like not really understanding, or is understand, like, I thought that that actor made really interesting choices who plays the dad in that moment, because you couldn't tell if he was confused or if he knew, if he there was some recognition there. Like, I thought that it was played so well where you were just like, does he recognize or doesn't he? And then you find out that he did, and I think that was like a really, really compelling, he didn't overly sell it or like transcribe that he was trying to, or telegraph that he was trying to be like, but I am your, like, it was, he definitely, like the way that he said the name of his mother, like her, and you kind of went, is he saying that because he recognizes the name or doesn't? Anyway, blah blah blah. Just actors geeking out over here, but yeah, like
All the
in that.
acting was so good in that way. And when he initially said, "You think your father was such a good man, like you were better off without him." And in that moment I was like, "Oh, I guess he wasn't his dad. Okay, fine." Like I didn't realize that he was saying I was not someone that should have been in your life. And like we never got to know what he meant by that, or like if he regretted that, or how long he knew, or if he had wanted to be involved, or there's that sort of, again, intergenerational family system stuff where if he was in addiction and a sense of unworthiness and whatever, and that's why he lived a life the way he did and decided not to be involved in his son's life because he didn't want to pass that on, and then finding out that his son took it on anyway, and
Mm,
ended up in a very, someone pointed out that it was a very Shakespearean tragedy sort of ending for Rick. It's like
mhm.
he couldn't avoid his "you killed my father, prepare to die,"
Yeah.
as Chelsea pointed out so astutely. That was just the way that it was going to have to go for him, and he could have made different choices. And he sort of tried to, especially when he reached out to the meditation teacher right before. And I was kind of relating to that moment because you're like, boundaries, girl, like you can't be, someone's savior. And also
Yeah.
sometimes there are moments as a counselor where you do drop everything and you answer someone's email or you answer their call because they're really suffering and you're their only lifeline. And again, that's kind of the ethical thing of like, when you're a counselor, a therapist, like, yeah, you should have those boundaries, and you want to hold people capable of taking care of themselves, and you have to be careful that you're not involving yourself so closely that someone's depending on you. Like, that's unethical too, right? Because
Mm,
you're trying to teach them how to, or support them, not necessarily teach them, but like support and guide someone to trust themselves and their own choices, and be empowered in their own lives. And you can't be their person. And at the same time, sometimes things come up and you do need to answer that call, or whatever it is. And that's again, that sort of ethical, non-violent thing where there's not an easy answer to how that's supposed to go. So, it was interesting to kind of see him being like, "I need to talk to you right now." And she was like, "I need 1 hour. Like, I have another client that I have to also attend to." And she doesn't know what's going on with the other client. Like, and she's
yeah.
also not a crisis counselor. Like, that's
No,
not what
no.
she's supposed to be doing. Right.
And like, what could
Um,
possibly be so serious that like you can't sit at the pool for an hour, like
yeah.
taking the circumstances that she wouldn't know about it, like just go sit at the pool. But yeah, I think it's interesting because I think like men like Rick are very, when men aren't always necessarily killing their fathers and like having these Shakespearean tragedies, but I
Hopefully
think
not.
that hopefully not, yeah. But like there is sort of like a, he is this grumpy old man who is cruel to Chelsea. Like, he is actively cruel to her. He seems annoyed at her at every second. And, you do wonder what the love between them was like before this, like why she is so attached to him. And the image that I keep like thinking of in this, like one of my kind of favorite like triangle moments of the whole season, was at the beginning. Chelsea in that sex scene where I think it's end of episode 1, she's sitting in his lap, she's looking down at him, and he is like looking up at her with like tenderness that like we didn't see. Like this was like a pure like cigarette smoking toxic masculinity jerk. And in this moment he is vulnerable to her, and she gives her breast to his mouth, like literally mothering in that moment. And she is really satisfied to be in the position of healer looking down at him, right? And it's almost like, I think, a real true depiction of that kind of relationship of like, he's typically dominating her, telling her she's stupid, whatever. But then when it comes to the sex, she kind of has the power, and she sees the healing in him, and she sees his vulnerability, and she sees it as beautiful. And so you kind of understand this, and then contrast that to the moment between Chelsea and Saxon when they're literally sitting eye to eye, like no one's above anyone else. They're sitting directly across from each other. They're looking at each other in the eyes, and you get the sense that Saxon really sees her for who she is, for her powers as like a healer, as a person who cares deeply about humanity and love. Like he is very intrigued by her, and he wants to be changed by her. Rick does not want to be helped by Chelsea at all. He sees it as probably emasculating. And the only time that he doesn't is when they're having sex. And so I think that's why Chelsea got so scared in that moment, is she pulls her hands away, because this is somebody who actually is actually genuinely connecting with her. And it's probably a moment of realization of like, that's unfamiliar to have somebody want to actually connect with me. She's spending the whole week making fun of Saxon, how he's soulless and nobody, he's probably not good at sex because like he doesn't have a soul, and that's not the kind of sex she's interested in. And here she is realizing that like maybe like her connection with Rick is a little bit soulless. And then as it turns out, it was like his promises to her were all too late. Like she is dead. She is bleeding in your arms. And now you're going to take it seriously. Like that to me is just, I think, like encapsulates the violence of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, especially of men of that kind of age who have a certain kind of like power in their violence, where it's like they sort of are not used to completely opening up. And of course, at the beginning, Amrita, the meditation teacher, is like, like she's telling him that like he's got this wall up and blah blah blah, and then by the end he has fully opened, but it's like, it's too late, you're about to be shot, your girlfriend is bleeding out on the ground, and her face at him is just like, I can't believe it. Like the way that she looks at him is just like, oh no, you were bad. Like all of this was bad, and it was too late for her, and it's too late for him. And I really resent people romanticizing this relationship, because I think it's incredibly messed up, incredibly toxic, incredibly sad, and Chelsea deserved a lot better. But anyway, so I'm kind of like, I kind of rambled in a tangent there, but yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I agree that I don't think this was a love relationship. I'm sorry for the I'm losing light, but I just the light burnt out in the room, so I just have one. And I just discovered it right before we got on the call, so probably best you can't see me that well. But yeah, I think, there's that moment where she says, Rick is, I'm hope and Rick is pain, and we're in this yin yang battle, and someone will win at a certain point. She's sort of explaining this to Saxon, and the way I read that actually was that Saxon heard her say, oh, here's how I get you. I have to be a damaged person that wants to be fixed. And if I can do that, then you will sleep with me. And so then he's like, oh, I need to be fixed. And she's like, oh, okay. And she sort of takes the bait. And then when they're together and they're meditating in her room or whatever, and he holds her hands, like, I think I interpreted that more as him being like, okay, let's hook up now. And she was like, no, I'm not doing that. Right. So I think that's an interesting take, because I also agree. Like, I thought Saxon was interesting because he was the most hateable in the beginning, but I feel like you do see him change. And this experience with Lachlan, as horrible as it was, it actually brought his soul to the surface, right? It was kind of like, that was not okay. Like, there is a limit to which this stuff is okay. And I realized all of a sudden that I've been mentoring my younger brother, like maybe in really the wrong ways. Like maybe I've been really hurting him with what I've been doing, just sort of casually being like, let's get laid, and like sex is the most important thing in the world or whatever. He kind of has this moment of like, wow, that went way too far. Like that is not what I wanted. And you kind of see his soul developing a little bit throughout the end. And a lot of people pointed out that when they're on the boat, I think in the beginning, they're doing the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil monkeys, where they
Yeah.
have the headphones on, the sunglasses, whatever it is. And then they do that shot again, but Piper has her earphones off because she's, awakened to her privileged, whatever, who she really is, the truth of who she is. And Saxon's actually reading the meditation book that Chelsea gave him. So he's sort of trying to open his eyes. And it's actually Lachlan who's got the sunglasses on, just, recovering from almost dying. And, again, we don't know sort of where he goes in that story, but it's interesting to sort of see how those images do change in terms of what the three of them learn and how different those three things are. So I think it's an interesting take to see Chelsea and Saxon as like, oh, what if we could actually connect on this level? I mean, I think for Chelsea, it would have to be more so somebody who actually had their own spiritual practice and could meet her on her level, rather than somebody that wanted to be taught by her. Because I think there are a lot of people who get into relationships with that dynamic of like, oh, I can fix you, I can make you better, all that stuff. And that's not love, that's transactional, right? And from Chelsea's perspective, like there's toxicity from Rick/Saxon in those ways of, I'm getting what I want. And I agree. Like, I think Rick was not trying to change. I think he was not trying to learn from Chelsea. Maybe he had some affection for her, but he was openly disrespectful to her all the time. And she was constantly having to apologize for him. So yeah, the person on the being fixed side of the equation is usually not great. It's someone who either doesn't want to be fixed, or if they do, again, they're absolving responsibility to somebody else, right? Of like that, she'll do it for me, or they'll do it for me, or whatever it is. So I don't really have to take responsibility for myself because my partner always will. A lot of heterosexual relationships just are that way. I think it's like a really, really common dynamic on some level or another. But from Chelsea's perspective, like from the fixer's perspective, that's also not loving.
No.
Because what it is this is how I am needed, and that's how I will claim my right to be in this relationship, right? So it's selfish in its own way. So I am going to stop our conversation here. We flowed for a long time talking about the White Lotus. And so we're going to pick this conversation right back up for part 2. But so that you're not totally overwhelmed by the content, you can take a break and listen to the rest right away or whenever you have time. So please go and check that out. It should be posted pretty much as soon as this one is. So go ahead and check that out. In the meantime, you can find me at Julie Peters Wellness on Instagram or Popcorn Therapy on TikTok. My website is juliepeters.ca. If you feel like tipping me, if you feel like sending me a couple bucks just for enjoying the podcast, which is not something that I'm doing for any kind of money at this point, just for the joy of it, please feel free to go to juliepeters.ca/tip me, and you can send me a couple bucks if you want to. So thank you for that. I also just really love and appreciate people, being a part of the conversation, listening to the episodes, sharing the episodes. So please feel free to send it to your friends, let people know about it, like, subscribe, all of those good things. Leave comments. I'd love to know your thoughts. Lots of people had lots of thoughts about White Lotus, so please feel free to share those and pick up the conversation next time in part 2.